Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. As dividend growth investors, there are thousands of stocks to pick from in the investing universe. So how do we know which ones to research for further consideration? We can choose our investments by names we recognize, like Apple, Johnson & Johnson, or Target. We can also choose from a best of list, like the Dividend Kings or Dividend Aristocrats. We can also choose companies that we hear on social media, through our friends, investment groups, and financial media, and we might uncover names like Costco, Microsoft, or Realty Income. We also might identify ETFs like JEPQ, VIG, and SHD. We can go with the current high yield investment, or we can find companies that have high dividend growth. While any of these methods may work, I'm sure that you would find top quality companies or funds with these methods. I am suggesting we choose a different way. I would recommend that we choose our investments to research and ultimately decide to purchase on based on our timeline and our income goals. If our goal is to create passive income to live off of, shouldn't the income that the investment generates guide us in what decisions we make? While a company like Apple with a 0.54% yield or Microsoft with a 0.83% yield may be a great investment, the question we should ask is, does it fit our income goals and timeline? These two investments would not meet the needs of most income investors unless your timeline is multi-generational at best. But we see time and time again that people have these investments and consider themselves income investors. I think we should reconsider. I have two main goals for my dividend growth investments. The first is to have a large enough dividend income stream in my taxable brokerage account to live off of the next 10 years. The second goal is our retirement assets that we'll be using for income starting about 20 years from now. Given the differences in our timelines for each goal, shouldn't we be investing differently for each? That's what I wanted to find out, so I took some time to calculate some hypothetical scenarios given different current yields and dividend growth percentages. I ran the annual dividends that would be received for a one-time lump sum investment into 5 different yield dividend growth combinations to see which combination would yield the most annual income based on the timeline that I would want. So I did a 0.5% yield with a 10% dividend growth. Example companies would be Apple and Microsoft, a 3% current yield and a 7% dividend growth. For example, Johnson & Johnson, Lockheed Martin, and VYM, a 5% current yield and 5% dividend growth, example would be Pfizer, or a 7% current yield and only a 3% growth, more like Enterprise Product Partners and Enbridge. And lastly, I did a 10% current yield with 0 dividend growth. Examples would be funds like JEPI and XYLD. So in my research, I was trying to identify how many years it would take for each combination of current yield and dividend growth to provide $1,000 and $2,000 a year in income on a one-time $10,000 investment with dividends reinvested on a quarterly basis. So let's look at the results. So from years 1 to 5, as you see, I have the amount of dividend income that will be received based on each of those investment choices. On the left, it has the number of years, and across the top has the current yield and dividend growth percentages. As you can see, in year 1, the 0.5% current yield would give us about $55 a year. But the 10% yield with 0 growth would give us over $1,000 the first year. Looking at the cumulative dividends received after the first 5 years, we can see that the 10% current yield and 0% growth far outpaces any of the other combinations when it comes to total income received, approaching almost $6,400 cumulative over the 5 years. In contrast, the 7% current yield and 3% growth is only giving us $4,600, and the 5 and 5 would give us about $3,300, 3 and 7 would give us $2,000, and the 0 and 10%, 0.5 and 10% would give us $341. So as you can see, if your timeline is between 1 and 5 years, you would be better off with a higher yield than a dividend growth strategy. Looking at years 6 to 10, we have a very similar approach. The 10% current yield is still the winner at $16,850 cumulative dividends after 10 years. 7 and 3 gives us 12,000. 5 gives us 9,200. 3 and 7 would give us 5,500. And the 0.5 and 10% would only give us about $915 cumulative in dividends over those 10 years. Again, the high yield beats the dividend growth up to years 10. Years 11 to 15, we're seeing a similar result, with the high yield of 10% and 0% growth still far outpacing the other options. As you might be thinking, a lot of us don't have more than 15 years until we need the money. So this really drives home the point that a higher current yield might be the right choice for you, as opposed to the traditional idea of dividend growth investing, where you get a 3% yield and 7% growth and live off the dividends later. A lot of us don't have it on timeline, so this might be something to consider. Looking at years 16 through 20, we see that the 10%, 0% combination is still beating the other options for cumulative dividends after 20 years. But you can start to see a transition from the 10% yield being the best to some more of the higher growth. For instance, at year 17, the 7% current yield and 3% dividend growth is actually providing more income at the year 17 than the 10%. And this is because the 3% dividend growth is finally making up for the lower starting yield of 7%. Looking at the other combinations, we're still far underneath the high yield. So even at a 20-year timeline, the higher yield at 7% and 3% growth, or the 10% and 0% growth, might still be the best options. But as you can see, the 5 and 5 is starting to catch up. 3 to 7 is doing okay, but the 0.5% with the 10% growth is still lagging way far behind. Looking at years 21 to 25, we're starting to see where the dividend growth is starting to pick up. In this particular slide, year 25, the 5% current yield and 5% dividend growth is starting to outpace the other two. Beginning at year 25, you'll have $18,000 in income, as opposed to $17,900 for the 7 and 3, and $11,000 for the 10 and 0. The 3% current yield and the 7% growth is still lagging way behind at almost $11,000 in year 25. 25 years is more than a lifetime for most investors. So again, you might want to consider the higher yield, higher dividend growth to be one of the choices you make for your investing. And I went ahead and looked at what 30, 35, and 40 years would be. Now, these are for some of our younger investors who have a long timeline. At this point, because you have such a long timeline, the dividend growth is starting to make a big difference. Looking at year 40, the 3% current yield and 7% growth far beats out all the other investment options. You would have $1,742,118 per year starting at year 40 if you deposited the $10,000 upfront and invested and reinvested over the next 40 years, getting a current yield of 3% with a 7% average growth. Looking at the 5-5, you're at 1.4 million, and the 7 and 3, you're at 413,000 and some change on the annual basis. But surprisingly, at the 10% and 0% yield, you're going to start seeing a significant reduction in the amount of income you receive compared to the other alternatives, because time has passed and the dividend growth and the compounding has worked against you with a 10 and 0, as opposed to having something like a 3% current yield and 7% growth. What I found most impressive is the 3% yield and 7% growth gives you cumulative dividends of over $5 million based on that one $10,000 investment. Time is definitely on your side. Some observations and takeaways that I identified was, in order to get $1,000 in dividend income, you would get that immediately at the 10% current yield. It would take 4 years to do it at the 7% and 3% growth, 7 years at 5 and 5, 11 years at the 3% current yield, 7% growth, and a whopping 26 years at the 0.5% and 10% growth. Similarly, for the $2,000 dividend income, the 10 and 0 would take 8 years, 7 and 3 would take 10 years, 5 and 5, 13 years, 3 and 7, 16 years, and 0.5 and 10% would take 30 years to get to $2,000 in dividend income. So the difference between the time required between the current yield of 10% and the current yield of 0.5% was 25 years for $1,000 in dividend income and 22 years for $2,000. Another observation that I found was that year 17 is where it really starts transitioning from a strictly high yield, low growth, or no growth investment option to something more like a 7% current yield and 3% growth. 17 years is a pretty good amount of time to go in order to get this transition. So if your timeline is less than 17 years before you need the money, you might want to consider the highest yield possible with low growth over the other alternatives. Another observation is the 3 and 7, as I mentioned before, it beats out all the rest at year 40, but it does take a lifetime in order to get there. So the main takeaway that I learned from this is that the 3% current yield and 7% growth, which is what most dividend growth investors tend to look for, is only good for the very, very long term. If your timeline is any shorter than 40 years, you might want to consider higher yield, lower growth options. So looking at my personal goals, my number one goal was to use my brokerage account in 10 years to live off of. Based on that timeline, my best bet is to go with the current high yield of 10% with 0% growth. That would give me $2,500 per year based on that original $10,000 investment, where the 7 and 3 would only give me $2,000, 5 and 5 would give me almost $1,500, 3 to 7 would give me $884, and the 0.5% and 10% growth would only give me $140. So this just reinforces my idea to invest in higher yield investments like closed-end funds and other REITs that are providing higher yields today. I don't have the time to wait for dividend growth to happen. On my second goal of 20 years from my retirement account, it gets a little bit more difficult to identify the best strategy. At 20 years, the 5 and 5 would give me about $6,800 a year. 7 and 3 would give me $7,900, and 10 and 0 would give me $6,800 almost. So I see 5 and 5 and 10 and 0 are very similar. So my takeaway for this one is, with my goal of 20 years, I would more than likely want to concentrate on a 7-3% portfolio, and possibly the 5 and 5, because after year 20, the 5 and 5 would provide me higher growth to maintain my purchasing power, but it would be somewhere in that range. The 0.5% and the 3% just aren't going to cut it with a 20-year timeline. So thank you for watching. Hopefully you found that useful. Please subscribe if you haven't, and please visit our website at dividendstockpile.com, or come chat with us on X at divstockpile. And while you're here, take a look at this next video. I appreciate your time. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.